A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, by William Shakespeare, from his play Romeo and Juliet. There are many ways to render a rose, and in this short series, we're going to do just that with OLO markers and the same rose line art. In this third episode, we're going to focus on cel shading, a style that was popularized by cartoons and anime. The downloadable rose line art is available at olomarker.com under resources. Like our other episodes, we are using the vintage rose theme. And to keep it extra authentic, I'm going to be using the chisel end of the OLO marker today. What is cel shading? Well, it's a style originally developed to paint on animation cells. It involves blocking out shadows and highlights with very little blending. Any motion and movement within animation is a set of thousands upon thousands of drawings, which you can imagine takes a very long time to color. So to simplify things, they cut it down to the base color, the shadows, and the highlights. I'm starting on the leaves and I'm using blue-green 0.8 Deep Sea. I'm doing this more as an undercoat for the shadow, and later on I'm going to go over with a richer green. But I really want to have that dynamic change in color from the shadow into our base coat. It is a staple of cel shading. When blocking out colors like I'm doing here, I really love to use the highest point of the chisel. It allows me to be really accurate with my placement, and it also allows me to make sure that I'm not going into the gutter. When I say gutter, what I mean is the area on the paper that's just about to touch the line. I want to keep that empty so I can utilize that space as a highlight later on or for the base coat. We can use it to basically create volume with very little effort. I've now switched over to my greens. My green 1.4 spearmint is going to go down first. I'm going to use that to sort of gauge how cold or warm I want these leaves to be. And then I'm going to go in with green 1.7, which is on the other side of my marker. I'll just flip it over. And that's going to really be our actual true base coat, or really what the leaf color truly is. You're going to see me switch my grip pretty often using the chisel, because depending on how you hold it and what part of the chisel you're using, you're going to get different effects. So for a lot of the finer work, what I like to do is use the highest point and use that to mark things off. When I'm doing more of a fill, I'm going to use more of an angle and just the side of the marker. You're going to find that it will spread very evenly, which is great. G1.7 Evergreen as now being used. I'm using it as almost an intermediate right now, so I'm testing the waters to see how well it's going to work with the blue from the blue-green. Both the caps are off, so now I'm going to be working with both spearmint and evergreen together, flipping from one to the other to get the perfect color that I'm looking for. I'm not blending. I'm not looking to create a gradient or one color going into the other. What I'm looking to do is use spearmint and evergreen together in order to create kind of something a little different. I'm not trying to work that blue-green in or have a fade. It's just really important to maintain those that divide that you have between the two. So here I've decided to use evergreen. I'm going to basically fill in right over the blue-green that I used, and we're then going to utilize that as our shadow because now we have a nice blue tint behind it, an undertone, if you will. Now that I've colored the leaves in, I want to let them completely dry. I'm going to move on to the shadows of my yellow roses, which is the top and the bottom rows. So rather than using sepia like I have in our previous episodes, what I'm opting to do is something that's going to make them pop completely. So what I'm doing here is using my reds, my red 5.5 Astilbe and red 5.7 Amaranth. And I know what you're thinking. Why red? That's such a weird color to go with yellow. Isn't that going to make orange? Well, yes and no. We're using red because shadows tend to reflect colors that are close to them, such as the red rose next to the two yellow roses. It also counters the blue-green shadow of the leaves underneath. What it's going to do is push our roses out from the background because blue or blue-green is going to recede. and our reds are going to come forward. So we're making a very clear divide right here in the very beginning, which is something that you need to be aware of when doing any kind of cell shading work. You need to make sure that the color balance, your cools and your warms, fit perfectly within the characters or objects that you're rendering. So, how do you know what color to use when? Well, it's practice and looking at other artists, like exactly what you're doing right now. So, great job. The more you look at what other artists do and go into that color theory, you're going to walk away a much better creative. So, great job. What I'm doing now is I'm using RK or red black as the shadow for my red rose. I'm doing this because I still want these shadows to be warm, and I don't necessarily want to use a still bee on this, even though it is fairly dark. It's not going to pop out enough versus the reds that I was going to use. So, in order to keep this coming forward towards us, I'm going to go with a red black. And then I'm going to place my base tone, one of my reds, next to it, and that's going to help pop it out and still distinguish it from our yellow roses behind it. I can't say enough how much I adore the chisel when it comes down to smaller or very precise work. I personally am a very heavy handed artist, so I need something that can really take a lot of pressure. Our brush tips are absolutely amazing, but you have to have just the right touch in order to utilize that line weight variance. When you're using the chisel and the very tip of it, you really know exactly what you're going to get out of it at any given time. So I really love doing these finer bits of detail with the chisel. If you're following along at home, take your time with this and really enjoy the feeling of the chisel on the paper. It really is very, very special. And the amount of control that you have in doing this, just let yourself feel out each line, each block of space that you color. And again, always make sure you have some kind of reference photo that you're following along with, whether it be this video or maybe just a photo of a cartoon flower. Now that the shadows are down for all of our flowers, we're going to move into our yellow oranges so our flowers can have a pop of color. I'm using yellow orange 2.2 pudding and yellow orange 2.3 butterscotch. I love to work light to dark. It's a habit that I just can't seem to break. So first up, I'm actually using pudding to fill in that smaller yellow rose. Now moving up to the top here, again, using pudding, we're going to go to the area where our red is. Since the red is now dried, we don't really need to worry about it bleeding or smudging or anything like that. And you watch right about here, you're going to see me change my grip. So before I was coloring very wide, now I've gone back to using the very tip of the OLO chisel. But I can lean it back and still have the entire marker on the page, which will then make a really great curved brushstroke. A lot of people would use that for calligraphy, script, and serif typeface. It's something that many people that use the chisel marker, they really use to their advantage. You'll even see me doing it right here where we do have it long ways and I'm just gently going in that curve because it fills so nicely. I'm now just going to follow the very edges here, just fill them in. I want to be able to have a little space that we can still keep as a highlight when really I'm not focusing so much on highlights. So we're going to smooth out some of these lines. All right, now we're gonna let the yellow flowers dry. Let's move on to our red flower. I'm gonna be using red 5.5 as still be one of my favorites, and red 5.7 amaranth. So we're gonna go in and all the areas where our dark shadow is, I'm going to block out the color and fill. So we're gonna be using the tip of our chisel and then changing our grip so that way we're going to be using the side and the fatter part. So as I continue around on this, you're going to see my lines are going to get thick and thin, and this is really the superpower of the chisel. We're definitely living in that ugly space right now, or it's like that ugly middle school version of our artwork. But don't worry, we're going to trust this process. And by the end, it's all going to be great because everything has to come in steps. So don't worry if your piece is looking a little haggard right now. It's going to come together. Just keep pushing through and keep trusting yourself and your ability to color. And trust the marker. OLO is such a high quality marker. Trust it. All right, now Amaranth is down. I'm going to flip the marker and we're going to put down a Stilby, which is a little bit lighter, the 5.5 versus the 5.7. What I'm hoping to do with this is smooth out a lot of those darker edges where Amaranth was, and I would just want to create a bit more softness. Although cell shading is built with large blocks of varying value, we still are going to have a little softness within each color. Hard shadows and soft highlights. So I'm switching over to red 5.1 Peony and red 5.3 Dusty Rose. We're going to basically, instead of having the white of the page be our highlight, we're going to be using Peony for our highlight in the red rose. We already have that stark contrast. So we have our shadow, we have our midtone, and we now have our highlight, and it's very clearly divided. We want to keep that as much as we can and only soften that highlight so much. Our roses have now pretty much been filled in. I'm going to go ahead and put away Peony and Dusty Rose, and we're going to move on and we're going to do the little leaves that are attached to the bottom rose here. So I'm going to use green 1.4 Spearmint as the base coat here. Then I'm going to switch it up and we're going to go into a yellow orange 2.2 pudding and a yellow orange 2.3 butterscotch because I still want to have that yellowish tint at the very edge. Now that everything has been colored, I'm going to start on the cleanup and detail work. Here I'm using Amaranth, which is what we used as our primary shadow for our yellow roses. I'm using it to clean up some of the lines and any areas that might have bled, while also trying to smooth out the inside. I'm going to do the same with the rose here on the bottom, being very careful not to oversaturate the page or spread things around. We want this to be very controlled. Next, I'm going to use green 1.7 Evergreen. I decided to match the leaves off of the rosebud a little closer to the leaves that were underneath. I'm now putting the stem in. Since it's dry, it's going to lay on a little heavier. Going back in with my RK Red Black, we are also going to tighten up those lines, make them a little bit sharper and cleaner. And I can do this as many times as I want. The key is to remember to take your time with this. Control the bleed and understand the way that you're holding the chisel is going to change the way the marker is going to put down any sort of mark. So get comfy and take your time with this. Enjoy it. I'm going to use Dusty Rose to smooth out the transition from my mid-tone, into Dusty Rose, the highlight. I'm doing this to accentuate the sharpness of the shadow, or the RK in this case, but I'm still being very mindful not to overwork this. As much as, I want there to be a little more softness, I don't want it to be a full soft transition. There needs to be separation. Yellow Orange 2.5 or Yellow Ochre is our midtone for this top flower. We're going to do the same thing we did with our red flower. So I'm going in, we're adding more of that yellow. You're going to notice as I do this, it is going to soften the red shadow a little bit. Some areas I do want to do this, but just like with our red rose, I want to make sure that there still is a very clear divide in those values. I might have said it before, but the chisel is just very impressive when it comes down to these smaller areas of detail. This touch-up part is perfect for the chisel. Let's bring out red 5.5 Stilby and red 5.7 Amaranth again. We're going to go more towards the center of the rose here, and I'm again just going to really tighten up those colors, specifically the shadow. I'm using Amaranth right now, and we're getting as dark as we possibly can. If you look closely after the brushstroke, you can see the shine of how much alcohol actually comes out of these markers. And it's pretty astounding how juicy Olo really is. So I just love to see the way that it lays down and then how quickly the paper also sop it up. So I'm using Express It blending card here. Every paper reacts a little differently, but Express It seems to keep the very saturated nature of OLO markers, something I really love about it. I'm going to use yellow orange 2.2 pudding, and we're going to continue that smoothing process. A staple of cell shading is your areas of large flat color need to be just that. They need to be flat. You can achieve this by going over that area once it has dried. Green 1.4 spearmint is what I've basically decided on when it comes down to the yellow of those leaves. It's going to help bring that yellow up into the green and keep those leaves still separate from what is underneath. The parts of the petals that have been flipped over towards the center of our rose need to be dulled out a little bit. I'm using a red grade 3, and this is going to help dilute that color that's there. So we're going to move away from that rosiness and more into something subtle. Now, in order to push it just a little bit further, I'm going in with a 0. And since the warm gray was still technically wet on there, it's going to help that bleed a little bit. So I'm going to work around the edges here and kind of build those highlights a little bit more. And the final color we're going to use is going to be yellow orange 2.3 butterscotch. So I'm going to go in using the fattest part of the chisel and really color in these yellow petals. I'm now going to take the time to do my final bit of cleanup. I'm using a water-based lining pen, and I'm just sharpening up the lines that might have gotten a little bit lost when I was coloring. Some of these areas did get very dark. I'm just tightening that up and just reestablishing where those lines are. And here is the final result. What do you think? Have you ever drawn anything in cell shading style before? Please consider sharing your creation with us at olomarker on all of our social media. Check out olomarker.com for more resources and, of course, to purchase any OLO markers. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Mina from OLO. I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay creative.